first of all, thank you guys for being here. This is the last class of the semester, right? Okay. Often closing on this deal. Thank you again, Chingling, for that amazing introduction. Again, that was so thorough, and it was like a whole arc of my life somehow flashed before my eyes. It was amazing. So thank you for that very generous introduction. I appreciate it. The real quick encapsulation of that is that I'm the editor-in-chief of Sierra Magazine. That's the national magazine of the Sierra Club. There are copies here for free if you want some. Take one, take all three, collect all of them, and enjoy. You can also find our daily news updates at sierramagazine.org. And then also, as Chingling said, I wrote last year a book called Satellites in the High Country. Those are not free. Those are 20 bucks a piece, cash only, which is going to inform a little bit about my talk tonight. As Chingling said, I've actually been giving a talk here in the War and Peace Lecture Series for actually more than 10 years, which is kind of incredible. But as you also saw from the slide title, I have updated it in the past couple years to kind of reflect some things that I've been thinking about as I was writing this book, Satellites in the High Country, which really, frankly, has got nothing to do with war and peace, or at least so I thought initially before I started writing. It's really about wilderness and wildness in the 21st century. But it's funny how some of the work that I've done over the years, actually around international affairs and conflict resolution, kind of thread themselves into the book in a way that I didn't expect. And when I came here to give last year's lecture, I was kind of struck by the way that these themes of war and peace even haunted and got mixed up in this book, again, that's about wilderness and wildness. And the way that it did that was through a chapter I got to write, as Chingling was mentioning, about wolves in the desert Southwest, but which is all set in this place called the Gila. The G is silent or pronounced, right, like a Spanish G. The Gila Wilderness in New Mexico. It's an incredible piece of land. It's basically like the Yellowstone of the Southwest. It's a huge complex of wild lands, high desert rangeland, kind of ripped from a Louis L'Amour Western. It's America's first legal wilderness. And you go there, and it really is this just incredibly rich natural landscape that is still home to all sorts of incredible wildlife. Again, I said the Yellowstone of the Southwest. You know, huge herds of elk, of deer. They say there's more elk in Catron County, New Mexico, than there are people. Deer, turkey, and just this really kind of naturally rich landscape, which is certainly how it was treated for tens of thousands of years by first the Mugian people, who were the civilization that was there for thousands of years, and then later in more modern times the Apache, who for whom this was really the center of their homeland, right? And even a figure as famous as Geronimo basically grew up on the west fork of what's now called the Gila River, and probably learned some of his squirreliness in the canyons there. Geronimo's actually born, Apache name was Gothalay, which is one who yawns. So he was kind of like a sleepy character and didn't do much until his 30s or 40s. But what made it, of course, heaven on earth for the Native Americans, for the Native peoples, also made it perfect landscape for white European settlers, when white European settlers came in. And the same things that made it this naturally rich grassland for the Indians, for the Apaches, also meant that it was the perfect place to graze cattle. And those open grasslands were just the perfect place not only to graze cattle, but also to cut down timber and logging, which of course is going to lead to conflict, right? It's going to lead to conflict over, well, who gets to control the land and how is it controlled, right? Who gets to call the shots on how the land is used? Is it going to be used for hunting elk and hunting turkeys, or is it going to be used for running cattle and cutting down trees? And that conflict, that competition, led to 40 years of conflict known as the Apache Wars. Eventually ended up with Geronimo and his resistance fighters being sent as prisoners of war to either Florida or Oklahoma, and basically the decimation of the Apache culture. And that's just, of course, like one small piece of a general U.S. policy of genocide and dispossession against the original inhabitants of this continent, which again was basically a conflict for resources, right? Who's going to get to control this vast continent and all of its wealth? And that's not just a historical story, right? It's happening today. It's happening right now at the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation on the Cannonball River, right off the Missouri River, where, if you've been following the news for many months now, thousands of native resistors, calling themselves water protectors, are fighting a massive proposed oil pipeline called the Dakota Access Pipeline. And as some of you, it's live. And if you've been reading the news headlines recently, you've been following this saga, right, of thousands of native resistors, of water protectors, getting in front of the pipeline and saying, no, we do not accept the risk that this poses to our sacred lands, and we don't accept the risk that this poses to the Missouri River, which is a source of drinking water for millions of Americans across the Great Plains states. And again, that old question really from moment go, right? Who's going to get to control the land? Who's going to make the decisions, and how is the land going to be controlled? Has so often provided the flashpoint for conflict or then for war. And so what I'm going to talk about tonight is it possible, and how can we, if not eliminate war, then reduce the incentives for war and reduce the incentives and the needs for conflict if we can find a different way of using resources. If we're going to accept that in many cases war and conflict are fueled by competition for scarce resources, how can we, I guess, certainly as a global civilization, but also just the United States, how can this nation stop being an aggressive nation if we can find a different way to live with harmony on the planet? And I certainly don't pretend to have any or even most of the answers about war and peace. I always check out the syllabus every year. It's an impressive lineup of speakers you guys have heard from, and obviously have explored ideas about war and conflict from all kinds of different angles. I do not pretend to know the human heart of darkness. I don't. Will war always be with us? I have no idea. Right? All sorts of things cause war: nationalism, religion, ideology, etc. Stuff that you guys have been talking about this whole semester. But what I am here to say is that I do think you could reduce the need to have wars all the time, and if not totally eliminate war and conflict, again, reduce it by finding a way to live more lightly on the earth. And again, it's not just a history lesson. It's not just crusade shots. It's in real time. If you think about the wars that have happened in our lifetime, if not totally in your immediate memory, but still thinking about in your lifetime, right, the conflicts in the Middle East, what's fueled those? Again, a number of things, right? Religion, nationalism, etc. But a huge reason why the U.S. is involved in those conflicts, why we have over the years gone through 3.5, depending on how you want to count, wars in the Middle East, is because it's a strategic region. And it's a strategic region because it's sitting on most of the world's oil, and because oil is the lifeblood of our industrial society. Right? So this is a shot actually from the first Gulf War, 91, 92 Gulf War. Saddam Hussein's armies pulling back and torching all the wells as they went. Of course, the most recent conflict is, being the war since 2003, in which we basically had for many, many years, and again, much of your lifetimes, a massive U.S. occupation force in Iraq, still a U.S. occupation force in Afghanistan, that had all sorts of negative blowbacks, right? Huge lasting damage to the U.S. reputation, a war that lasted for years, took up, hundreds of billions, trillions of dollars. 31,000 U.S. men and servicewomen wounded, 4,400 U.S. servicemen and women killed, estimated 100,000 plus Iraqi casualties killed. And for what? To basically then still leave the country and leave it, in it's hard to say better or worse shape, but certainly not good shape, right? And again, why are we there? Again, because Iraq and Kuwait and all those nations are major oil producers. And the question is, it's really interesting to think about is like, even after we've left, there's been no real peace dividend. So you can see U.S. defense spending, 1988, that's in there obviously because end of the Cold War, Berlin Wall falls in 1989, so it's the height of U.S. military. And these are all in inflation-adjusted dollars, right? So these are all apples to apples. Right before the fall of the Berlin Wall, we're spending $550 billion on on defense. By 2010, so that's kind of after the peak of action in Iraq, but still things are pretty intense in Iraq and Afghanistan, spending $853 billion. By 2015, last year, we've mostly pulled out of Iraq, but we're still spending $756 billion. So that's a decrease for sure, right? But it's still like, okay, well, the war is over in Iraq, and we're still spending $756 billion a year on defense. Again, defense in air quotes. Because, as I'm going to point out, it's not really defense. Our U.S. military budget is to sustain this giant, essentially imperial force that's around the world. So there's a map of U.S. global military bases. So according to the Pentagon, the U.S. military maintains 662 bases in 38 countries. And some say the number of foreign bases is a lot higher. It depends upon how you define a base, right? So the question is this really a defense posture? Is this a defense posture, or is this more of an imperial posture meant to, again, sustain the kind of global status quo? And do we really need this, right? Is this really necessary? Is this really necessary for the United States of America? Is this necessary for us as Americans to have this giant spread out military force? Is it necessary for us to spend more on our military than the next 13 countries combined, right? So is that a defense budget? Or again, is that really an offensive budget? Is that a budget that's about, again, sustaining this ginormous global imperial web of force? What's so interesting about this, you look at, even our next biggest strategic competitor, China, we're spending 6 times more than. When you look at something like a weapon system like an aircraft carrier. So an aircraft carrier is interesting, right? Because an aircraft carrier is not a defensive system. If you just need to protect your coastlines, you don't really need an aircraft carrier because you can launch your planes and stuff off your coast. You need an aircraft carrier if you want to project force and deploy force in something that's not exactly defense. So the United States has got 10 aircraft carrier groups. China's got 1, and Russia's got 1. So we've got 5 times as many aircraft carrier groups as the next 2 biggest strategic competitors combined. And again, that's not a defense posture. That's an offensive posture, or at least it's a posture meant to, again, sustain a certain status quo. So what's that status quo? I mean, basically the status quo is the fact that the United States, even though we're only about 5% of the world's population, consumes roughly 18-20% of the world's resources. And that is essentially an unsustainable way of continuing to do business. But it's been the kind of foundation of U.S. foreign policy for a long time. Here's again President H. Walker Bush during that lead up to the Gulf War, saying the American way of life is non-negotiable, and really kind of pointing out that yes, we can't have Saddam Hussein seize oil resources in the Middle East because it's going to make, again, our way of life difficult, and because, yeah, everything runs on oil, at least everything runs on energy. And I'll get to this later. It doesn't necessarily need to run on oil, but it does need to run on energy. And right now, oil is the most dense, dense and transferable energy resource we have. And it's what sustains this, right? It's what sustains our entire life. It's the lifeblood of our society. So there's a direct line, right, from this to this. And there's a direct line also from this to this. This is a coltan mine, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, right? So all of these electronics, which are awesome, I've got one, I've got this thing here, all of these amazing electronics that make our life possible also come from the earth, and someone else also has to dig that up someplace and get it to us. So it's not just about oil, it's about, in fact, all the things that we just need to eat from the earth, whether that's timber, whether that's farmland, whether that's coltan that no one's barely even heard about, come from a place that no one's barely even heard about, to sustain our lifestyle. But don't take my word for it. This has really, again, been the basis of U.S. foreign policy since the end of World War II. So here's George F. Kennan. He was one of the sort of wise men that was in the State Department right after World War II and helped lay the modern foundation of American foreign policy. So here's him. I'll read it to you. You can read it along with me. And again, these numbers are a little bit different now. Now that first number's gone from 50% to a mere 18, depending upon how you count. And 6.3 has gone to 5. We've got about 50% of the world's wealth, but only 6.3% of its population. In this situation, we cannot fail to be the object of envy and resentment. Our real task in the coming period is to devise a pattern of relationships which will permit us to maintain this position of disparity, To do so, we'll have to dispense with all sentimentality and daydreaming, and our attention will have to be concentrated everywhere on our immediate national objectives. We should cease to talk about vague and unreal objectives such as human rights, the raising of living standards, and democratization. The day is not far off when we'll have to deal in straight power concepts. The less we are then hampered by idealistic slogans, the better. And so in some form or another, I mean, you have, obviously, this goes in an ebb and flow. You could have, say, a president like Carter, who I think probably was pretty sincere about human rights and the raising of living standards and democratization. In some ways, you could also say the same of Obama, though, a lot of people joke that his Nobel Peace Prize was mostly just for, having good chemistry. He should have gotten the prize in chemistry. But even folks like that who come in with good, say, intent, they're trapped in the kind of status quo, and I'll get to this in a little minute, of this need to maintain this disparity. And a good example of this, again, this is started under the Obama administration, is the new U.S. Central Command in West Africa. So why do we have a U.S. Central Command in West Africa? Because, and this is a report from Congress, in recent years, analysts and U.S. policymakers have noted Africa's growing strategic importance to U.S. interests. Among those interests are the increasing importance of African natural resources, particularly energy resources. And you can see there oil reserves in countries like Nigeria, Gabon, etc. So again, you can see the clear line between a strategic interest kind of follows the resource interest. And the key resource interest, again, is oil. You can look at a place like, again, in Africa, Djibouti, which you can see there on the inset map. It's in the Horn of Africa. It's not an energy drink. It's actually this really tiny little country, former Italian protectorate, that's right there at the mouth of the Red Sea. And there's a U.S. military base there with a Marine detachment, and those Marines are there to basically make sure that stuff continues to go through the Red Sea. And in some ways, it's a good thing, right? You don't want like pirates cruising in all the time and grabbing Captain Phillips and creating a mess, and you do want to like maintain things against, say, like piracy. But at the same time, why are the Americans at that choke point? To keep all the goods and services flowing through the Suez Canal. And while we're here in North Africa, it's interesting to think about something like the Arab Spring and how even, you could take somebody like Obama with all sorts of goodwill and probably that humanitarian and human rights instinct and still has to kind of follow the imperatives of this system that's been set up. So here's a photo from Tahrir Square during the Arab Spring, right? This democratic uprising that starts first in Tunisia, then sparks across North Africa and into parts of the Middle East. In Tunisia, the U.S. supported it. After first hesitating it, supported it in Egypt, but did not support the Arab Spring when it expanded over to Bahrain, which is a small little nation in the Persian Gulf, and basically encouraged or at least assented to the Saudi military going in there and brutally crushing the entire uprising. I'm sure that's got nothing to do with the fact that Bahrain is the base for the U.S. Fifth Fleet, right? So, in a place that's got less strategic importance, like a Tunisia, a democratic rebellion from below can be encouraged or at least tolerated. In a place like Bahrain, it's not going to be encouraged and certainly not going to be tolerated if you've got the U.S. Fifth Fleet based there. But again, I'm just a hippie from Oakland. Don't take my word for it. Here's James Woolsey, director of the CIA during the Clinton administration, talking about how our reliance on oil does twist our foreign policy and does twist even what we'd think of as American values when push comes to shove. The heart of the matter is oil. Coal is a problem from the point of CO2 emissions and pollution, but oil is a problem for those reasons and for reasons of national security. In part that our billions a day that we borrow to import oil finances institutions like the Saudi Wahhabi schools around the world that teach little boys murderous hatreds of Shiite Muslims, Jews, homosexuals, and apostates. Not to mention hatred of Americans and the terrible oppression of women. And it helps fund murderous dictators around the world. We're paying for that, and it's nonsense. We need to stop using oil, not just imported oil, but oil, period, to move away from that kind of thing. And what that kind of thing is against violence and extremism. Here's another former director of the CIA talking about how, and this is sort of a different take on the issue, right? Because it's not just about how our reliance skews things, but also how our reliance, our over-reliance, our sort of overconsumption of resources creates scarcity that creates the breeding grounds for intolerance, for hatred, and for conflict to spread. Today, there are 7 billion people sharing the planet. By mid-century, the best estimates point to a world of 9 billion. Just beyond the raw numbers, many countries will have a large concentration of young people. If their basic freedoms and basic needs, food, housing, education, employment, are not met, they could easily be attracted to violence, civil unrest, and extremism. One last quote, 3 times the charm. There can be no peace if the resource base that people depend on for sustenance and income is damaged or destroyed, or if illegal exploitation finances or causes conflicts. You think about a place like, again, that dude guarding the mine in Democratic Republic of Congo for the coltan that's running this PowerPoint right now. If those people don't have, again, basic sustenance, if the forests have been chopped down, if the rivers have been ruined because a multinational oil corporation came in there and there was an oil spill, if their pastures have been otherwise ruined through some sort of, let's say, drought or flood connected to climate change, they're going to be poor and they're going to be pissed. And they're going to create the kind of, again, atmosphere in which people are going to be easily recruited for terrorist organizations or whatnot, because they basically just don't have the basic human necessities to live. And it does show, again, that connection between just not only resources as a source of conflict of fighting over, but when there are no resources, leading people to desperate acts. So it all gets back to some bumper sticker wisdom. Attributed to Gandhi, that may be apocryphal. Live simply so that others may simply live. Or basically just share and share alike. And the point being that we can't really, if you have a situation in which 5% of the world's population is using 20% of the world's resources, that kind of inherent inequality and unfairness is going to breed conflict. And so if we can find some way here in what's still the world's richest country, if we can find a way to use a little bit less so that other folks have got a little bit more, that will hopefully reduce the incentives for needing that giant military, for spending that $756 billion a year on what's an offensive force, not a defensive force. I think actually the roadmap for doing that is not pie in the sky. It's not that hard, right? There's a number of pretty basic things. Instead of coal plants, which not only fuel global warming, fuel local air pollution, which causes asthma, which is a total drag, let's have windmills, right? And find a way to power this economy off of clean renewable energy. Instead of sitting in line in traffic, that's how I got here, right? And that's why I barely got here at the nick of time, because the 101 was a mess around Petaluma. It's a total surprise, right? Shocker. God, it was worse. 101 south of the Richmond Bridge looked like purgatory. Instead of sitting in traffic all day and in the course of it wasting your life and spewing heat-forming gases, let's find ways to have mass transit, to have bicycles, to have interconnectivity between those things. Again, I keep saying this, like every year I say this, I can't wait till the train is totally done. And I could literally go, if I could seriously go from Tiburon to Roanoke Park, I would much prefer to sit on the train and read for an hour and a half, even if it would take longer than being stuck in traffic in Petaluma. Instead of diets that not only are causing an obesity crisis, a diabetes crisis, a public health crisis, leading to the fact that this generation in this room is going to be the first in U.S. history to have a shorter lifespan than its parents, and a diet that, because of industrial farming, has so many other knock-on consequences for oil, for land, for water quality, for air quality. Instead of that, can we move to more of an organic system that is looking at how to use wild nature as an ally as opposed to an enemy you always got to trample over? Instead of having deforestation, here's a palm plantation in Borneo that used to be a rainforest with orangutans. Now they grow palm oil there, which goes into cookies and makeup. Instead of that, how can we, again, create an economy that's more, again, built on biomimicry and is looking at ways to surf off of natural systems, or at least embed sustainability in its core and uses sustainability as sort of the key metric of progress and the key metric of quality of life and well-being. And I think if we do those things, if we can find ways to use less imported energy, less imported food, less imported palm oil, if we can find a way to use the natural wealth of this country, that was here and is still here, but was here in 1491, and we can find a way to use that natural wealth in a more mindful way and not have to suck up all this stuff from the rest of the world, I think that holds out the opportunity for a very American ideal, which is to be one country among many, not this giant global superpower with bases in 60-plus countries, in 10 aircraft carriers, and spending more on our military than the next 13 powers combined. How can we be one nation in a community of nations and not have to exercise all of that wasted time, treasure, and lives on misadventures? I think that's a very American ideal, and I think I could probably even get Geronimo to agree. So that's that. Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate it. Be much more interesting to have a conversation than a monologue. So let's just open it up for comments, questions, statements. Yes, sir. Well, so just to make sure everybody got the question, it's, what's going to happen? There's billions of other people who also want prosperity and deserve it, and no one deserves to have, dangerous water that's going to kill your kids and no food, and want to enjoy a prosperous lifestyle. And how do you do that? And how do you make it really profitable, right? Because we live in a global capitalist system, and you've got to find a way to play within those rules. I think the first answer to your question, and this has been talked about for a while, we've not totally seen it, but we might finally be getting there, is could the big new industrializing powers like India and China leapfrog? Like, no one says you have to go from like horses to coal to oil to then solar. You don't have to like replay the whole Dickensian scene again and turn Beijing in 2015 into London in 1855. Now that is in fact more or less what's happened, but we're starting now to see the glimmers of actually the Chinese are thinking, yeah, maybe the leapfrog would be better, right? And actually starting to shut down their coal plants, shut down their coal mining industry, which is leading to significant social unrest, right? Because you've got these coal miners in China being like, what happened to our jobs? But I do think, so that's the vision, right? Is you don't need to totally follow the American path of development. Unfortunately, and that's the reason why you need to sort of change the model here. Why did Bangkok have to go to this model where all of a sudden you're going to dump 10 million cars on the street and have a giant traffic jam 365? You could have had the opportunity there to actually do a leapfrog model. And so that's the hope, is can you, instead of always copying this American system that's got some built-in perversities around it, just go to the next step. And I think at least in the energy sector, we're seeing that with China and India saying, yeah, we could maybe ditch the coal stage. China more than India. And then, yes, there's obviously a lot of money to be made doing that. General Electric and Siemens are not building wind turbines out of the goodness of their hearts. People at Siemens and General Electric are making a bunch of money on wind turbines. And Elon Musk is not an idiot, right? And his solar company is going to make a bunch of money, and then he's going to sell the solar that he's capturing to the cars that he's making. Well, that's a pretty smart cornering of the market. So yeah, there's a lot of money to be made in this. And that's why, and this maybe will organically come up, why I think for obvious reasons the Trump victory is very discouraging to the environmental community. There are some things that are so baked in that even Trump or allies in Congress, Trump, Pence, Ryan, could not stop, because the smart money in Silicon Valley is already like, this is where the future is. There's no bringing back the coal jobs in this country. So the smart money is already moving towards the clean, renewable economy. So yes, there's a lot of money to be made, and that's, again, I think already where the smart money is going. Yeah. That's it? Yes. Yeah, so the question was any opinions on who Trump has or has not selected for various environmental posts. I mean, you can go to sierramagazine.org. We did a roundup, another one of the editors did a roundup the other day on possible, so the most important stuff is like Department of the Interior and EPA and Department of Energy, kind of transportation. Department of Interior might be the current Oklahoma governor. She'd kind of be a disaster. She'd be actually the first Interior Secretary ever to not be from the West. Depends if you think of Oklahoma as the West. I don't really, but I'm from Arizona. So I have a hard line on where the West begins and ends. But could be the Oklahoma governor. She'd be a disaster. The guy who's heading the EPA transition team is a climate change denier. The chatter on the other side is Ivanka Trump believes in climate change, which again is like a no-brainer if you're 35 and under, which she is. And then Trump met with Gore yesterday, but I don't know what that means. So I think in general, it's less about Trump than it is about the Republican, than it is about anti-science or anti-environment folks in Congress using a Trump presidency to kind of roll back landmark environmental laws like the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, that protect our public health. That said, I don't think, I might not be, I'm not a Trump fan, but I would like to think that I could be friends with many Trump voters. And there's a big difference about the thing. And Trump voters, I do not think were voting for a rollback of the Clean Air and the Clean Water Act. And in fact, 75% of Trump voters, according to one poll, think we need to accelerate the transition to a clean energy economy. And you can look at a state like Florida, which Trump carried and voted down a totally ridiculous anti-solar amendment, right? So people there in the Sunshine State, right, where it's like a no-brainer to put a solar panel on every rooftop and create a ton of jobs and make a lot of money doing that. You can imagine a voter there voting for Trump and saying this solar amendment is bananas, and that went down in flames. So. I think there's a lot of space for it's a blessing and a curse to be born in interesting times, right? We'll see how it all shakes out. Yes. That's an incisive question. That's like that. I mean, yeah. Sorry. That's the question, right? Can we manage? Is society smart enough to organize a managed descent, or do we have to do things the hard way? There's no argument with physics. The atmosphere and the oceans do not care whether you believe or do not believe in global climate change. Physics and chemistry are immune to your beliefs. They're going to change, and they're going to change at the speed they want. Okay? So the trick now is, can we, and we means, again, citizens, government, businesses, etc., get smart and find a way to sustain 7, 8, up to 9 billion people on the planet in a way that doesn't totally wreck the natural systems on which civilization depends. Okay, so are we smart enough to do that, or will things have to happen the hard way? And the hard way is really grim, right? It does mean, in fact, droughts and serious, much more intense refugee crises than we're currently seeing, right? If your country turns into a dust bowl, you're not going to stay. There's a very clear case to be made. I didn't bring this up, but pretty clear case to be made that the Syrian civil war could have been sparked by or fueled by a large drought that began in 2013 and 2014. So if everybody's really hungry and all the farmers get pushed off their land and end up in the cities with no jobs, you know, you can end up with a civil war. So I think we'll see other refugee crises spurred by environmental dislocations. Again, that's the bad scenario. And the scenario that I'm hoping to share with you tonight and encourage you to get involved in is, how do we do the smart scenario, which is thinking more deliberately about how we use scarce resources: water, topsoil, the atmosphere, the oceans, et cetera. Mark me down as cautiously optimistic. Cautiously optimistic, we'll pull it out. Okay, you get a second bite of the apple.
I heard you mention biomimicry. Can you explain a little bit more about how that will help with our overall sustainability efforts where energy is concerned?
Sure. So what's biomimicry? So anybody here environmental studies major, environmental science major? Maybe? No? Okay. So biomimicry is this idea that how can you look at how does the mollusk hold itself to the rock even though it's getting pounded by waves that are 500 times in force, right, greater than it is, without any industrial solvents, right? Or without any industrial, it's just natural glue. How do you look at that, break that down chemically, and re-engineer it without using petroleum to create other materials that we need to hold this building together, right? And there's a lot of scientists working on this. As we crack more, how does this cobweb, you know, how does the spider create a web that's as strong as it is? Could you re-engineer that and instead of steel cables, right? If we can crack some of the code on biomimicry, that's about making materials from life. And so you don't need to exactly dig up the earth. I mean, yes, you still need some sunlight and some water, but then you don't need to be digging up the earth to convert all this stuff. And in general, it's sort of a way of thinking about how can we mimic our own economic, industrial systems on natural systems. And organic agriculture is the best example of kind of working practice, right? Instead of trying to put up the dam and stop the river, surf on the river, right? Hope that more or less makes sense. Someone else must have a comment, a question, polemic, observation. Yes, sir. That's a really good question. Like, you know, there is an office in the White House called the Office of Public Engagement that's sort of, and in different administrations it works different ways, is there to engage with citizens groups. Yeah, I mean, that is, time will tell the interest or the willingness of a Trump White House, Trump administration to engage with different constituencies. I mean, the one thing, you know, we would never be seeing this. I did an article for a magazine a couple weeks ago about the situation at Standing Rock. The new force and strength of the native sovereignty movement has in part been fueled actually by a new posture from the Obama administration, which, you know, the way that Obama's 19th century predecessors would have thought about it, Native American relations were foreign relations. They're independent nations, right? That's how it was like for 19th and 18th century US presidents. Like, your biggest foreign policy concern was Indian policy. In that sense, perhaps Obama's biggest foreign policy accomplishment is his new stance towards native sovereignty. He's the only president who's had a White House meeting with native nations every year of his administration. And his Department of Interior and Bureau of Indian Affairs has totally tried to reset relations between the US government and these sovereign nations that we call tribes. And I do think it's emboldened stuff like the native resistance at Standing Rock. So yeah, like, would that kind of, is that space going to be there under a Trump administration? No. And that will probably spur many progressive grassroots groups into more of a posture of opposition. Yeah, that makes sense. So yes, I think more opposition is what you're likely to see. How are we doing on time?
Oh, good. I want to ask a question as well.
Oh, okay.
The polemical one.
Oh, polemical question, good.
Is it possible for the U.S. to hold on to the resources and not letting other nations
Is it just physically?
Possible that instead of actually, like reduce and simplify, that we hold down and fight to defend resources around the world so that we can actually make sure that U.S. people have it all? Is it possible?
That's a great question. Is it possible? How long do you kind of hold on to this dream? Yeah, I actually don't. That's the thing. I don't actually think it's possible. I mean, not only do I obviously not think it's worth it in terms of like the treasure expent, but how long is it really possible? How long do you kind of keep going before you alienate too many nations, or the cost becomes so much, or the cost again? I think one of the sort of things we've seen since the latest conflicts is how long do you ask an all-volunteer army to do that without having conscription? At what point is that really fair, right? That it's mostly poor young American women who enlist in the army or enlist in the armed forces. And how long is that fair to ask an all-volunteer army to do all the dirty work for everybody else? I don't know how long that's politically possible until you have to go to conscription, and then people are like, conscription? I'm not, I don't want to go to. I don't want to go to Democratic Congo for the coltan for my phone. That doesn't sound like a good deal. So yeah, I don't think it's possible. I think eventually this strains start to show.
So obviously there's a lot of steps we need to take to live sustainably, but in your opinion, what's like the first most effective step a person can take on an individual scale to living sustainably?
Can you do two? Okay. It's energy and diet. I mean, it's really energy for sure, and a big part of energy is diet. So energy is kind of simple, is not as simple. I mean, there's a lot of things, but here in California, it's amazing. Here in California, we've not increased our electricity use in almost 30 years, even as the population and the economy has grown. And that's just some very simple stuff, and this is going to sound ridiculous, but it is some very simple stuff like turning off the lights when you're not in the room. Those sorts of things do it up. If you are a homeowner, most people in here are probably not homeowners. If your parents are homeowners, trying to do solar panels, which are increasingly affordable. In energy transportation, what are mass transit, carpooling, or bicycling options? Obviously, that's harder in a more spread out place. And then your other major impact of your footprint is just sustaining yourself as an animal, right, is eating. So how can you think of ways to eat lower on the food chain? So I'm not a vegetarian, but I don't eat beef. Beef, I think, is increasingly hard to defend from a climate standpoint. Actually, so is lamb. Everybody thinks lamb is kind of sustainable because it's cute and kind of runs around the Sonoma hills, but lamb's actually really bad. So yeah, basically diet and thinking about, again, it's not about being abstentious, right? It's not about like putting on, being a hermit. It's about making wiser choices, and finding a happy medium. Like, do you need to, eat meat every day, or is like 4 days enough for the week? And you're still going to get like tons of protein and be fine. And have a healthful life. And again, what's the option of like, okay, biking once or twice a week, and then that's like, don't go to the gym that week, whatever. So energy and diet, for sure. Those are the two biggest things. And then, of course, then get engaged politically, because all of us in this room, we're only addition, right? You should do those things. Like, yes, eat low on the food chain, turn off the lights, change the light bulbs, like ride your bike when you can. But that's just really, that's like personal hygiene stuff, right? It's like no one needs to tell you like, oh, good job for brushing your teeth, right? We need to sort of just kind of change some of the culture around this, and it shouldn't be exceptional that you're doing those things. And as valuable as those things are, it's only addition. It's only 1 + 1. And at this point, addition is not sufficient. We need multiplication. Another thing that can really do the multiplication is either the power of business or the power of the government. So the most important thing is really get involved in political efforts, in electoral efforts, in citizen engagement efforts to change the policies. Because when the policies change, then it allows your addition, your 1 + 1, to get a multiplier on it, and for everything to move much more quickly. So it's not enough to like just kind of drive a hybrid car. Like, send a letter to the EPA saying we need to increase fuel economy standards. Because if all the companies have to increase fuel economy standards, it's not a burden on any one company, right? Nor is it a burden necessarily on any one family. So changing the rules of the game. And the only way the rules of the game get changed is through politics or business. So create something amazing, become a billionaires, and then go fund all this stuff. Do we have time for one more? Oh, it's a follow-up.
Why do you think a lot of such as Sierra Club, a lot of environmental groups won't talk about eating lower on the food chain as a source of sustainability?
That's a great question. I just came from a really long, boring three-hour meeting about that yesterday. It's a personally loaded thing, and it's a culturally loaded thing. So a lot of almost every culture, right, is kind of revolves in large part around food, because that's where the family gathers, that's where the culture gathers, right, around holidays, whatever. And traditionally, most of the world's diets are pretty meat-centric, because meat, like gasoline, is a highly dense form of energy that you can move around very easily. So it's kind of a cultural landmine, and then it's also a personal landmine because eating's so personal, and can so easily slip into like a weird kind of judgment space in a way that yeah, you obviously make a statement with your automobile, but it's less of kind of a hard thing to put out kind of a message around that. But it, I think, goes to show why the organic farming movement and sort of the good food movement is so potent, because it goes to show that, again, making some changes is an increase in quality of life, not a decrease in quality of life. Right? The comparison between the farmer's market tomato and the Safeway tomato. It's like night and day. It's no comparison. You don't need to be told which one tastes better or is juicier or is fresher. And so I think the reason why the organic movement, good food movement, has this cultural force is because it makes very clear, if you kind of go green, you're actually going to have a nicer quality of life. Right? Again, I'd rather have the windmills up on the ridge than the smokestacks giving everybody asthma. So that's the other flip side of the coin. In some ways, it's also potent to talk to people in a way that is sort of shiny and happy and feel good. Uh-huh.
So you mentioned, choosing foods from farmers markets versus stuff that's kind of Safeway, the organic movement. With that being said, there is a big push for people to eat organic, and in order to be organic, Sonoma County just voted no to grow GMOs, but I believe, and I also know that, genetically modifying our food is a great way to promote sustainability and to become sustainable. So, you're kind of at a crossroads between people who care about the environment and want to eat organic and want to do better by that. But then, are we kind of prompting, or pushing for something that may not, I want to say, are we stuffing the sustainability that we could be achieving by promoting these things?
Yeah, I mean, that's the GMOs thing I'm not really going to get into, because I actually don't have much of a dog in the fight. I'm actually, in my circles, kind of an iconoclast on it. I mean, I kind of agree. Mark Bittman, the New York Times food writer, had a great line about GMOs in the food system. He's like, getting rid of dynamite's not going to get rid of, this is also good for the War and Peace lecture series, getting rid of dynamite's not going to get rid of war. And GMOs in the food system are kind of like, it's not going to change, it doesn't really actually change much so far. GMOs have in a way been a wash. They've not been the huge game changer, nor have they been the huge boogeyman that people make them out to be. And so I actually don't have much of an opinion on GMOs. But I think what's kind of embedded in the heart of your question, though, also is questions of technology. And where does technology or advanced technology fit in making this leap to renewable, sustainable, lighter footprint economy? And I think that's a really difficult question. It kind of depends technology by technology. Certainly also in climate space, people, there's some people who say we're going to have to keep around nuclear energy if we're going to sustain greenhouse gas emissions, and we may need more nukes. Now, that's a point of view that I disagree with, but it's a real debate that's out there, and it kind of gets again to this question of technology and how much of these issues are going to be resolved by big techno fixes, and how many of them are going to be sort of more from the kind of more from the grassroots. So I think there's going to be a lot, no matter how fast or slow this transition to a green economy goes, along the way there's going to be a lot of bumps as people have debates around which technologies are kind of appropriate and which are not.
I want to address your question. I think part of the GMO issue is also how much public scrutiny do we get? Is it corporate driven, right? Does corporation have more authority to determine, what the kind of choice that we make, right? Or, do the public actually can come to a deeper and long discussion and make real choices on that, right? And when we have corporate interest driving everything, then it becomes a very challenging situation. I'll give another example. Like say, a lot of the time, the reason why, Plain, Michigan, or Detroit wasn't revived was part of it because of the fact that capital left and never looked back, right? And there's something that, that you cannot solve with profit only incentive, right? So when you actually look at the triple bottom line, for example, when you actually think about environmental impact, human impact, and profit, then you come to a different decision than a profit-driven one, right? That's why I'm highly questioning a lot of profit-driven environmental decisions, because profit can only go so far. And then, to what extent is it more beneficial for the planet to die, or is it, the question that, who is going to ask? Does capitalism will ask that question, or do people ask that question, right? And if the planet were to actually slowly die, without hindering profit, right, then to what extent can we actually say no to that model? And I say this as somebody who actually have seen a lot of green economic incentive only benefiting particular groups without really addressing a lot of key issues of the development. Do you have anything to add to that?
I think Chingling makes a good point that, and I still agree that in the short term you have to create a lot of economic incentives for people to engage in this stuff. I do think eventually though the profit motive only goes so far, and again that gets back into writing the rules of the game. How can citizens working together change the laws which change the rule of the game, and that essentially compel corporations to do the things that we feel are in the public interest. Because I do think the profit motive is only going to go so far, and I think you see that with some respects with the Nature Conservancy, which is a large environmental group's efforts to work with folks like Dow Chemical and say, oh, will you protect this little wetlands over here because it's actually good for your water filtration for all the stuff that's coming out of the factory. In the short term, Dow's going to say, yeah, maybe they pencil it out, and actually, yeah, they're going to save a couple mil a year on that plant with this wetland. But really, at the end of the day, if Dow did the numbers again and they were like, no, if we get rid of that wetland, we'll make an extra 10 mil, the wetland's going to be gone, right? So I think, and this is the idea of that idea of ecosystem service, that's really great as far as it goes. The problem is it may only go so far. And when you really did come to a clash of values between economic values or environmental protection values, the economic values are probably going to win out if it's a corporation that's making the call. Thank you guys so much. Thank you for coming.